Nietzsche began his philosophical journey deeply fascinated by Schopenhauer. He saw him as a master of pessimism, someone brave enough to face suffering head-on and say, "Life is pain." For a time, Nietzsche was his student, quiet, observant, almost devout. Schopenhauer believed the world was driven by a blind force, the will, an endless impulse that makes us desire, suffer, and repeat the cycle forever. Life, to him, was a mistake, and the wisest path was to deny the will, silence our desires, and find peace in art and detachment. Nietzsche, however, saw a bigger danger in that: escape. In his view, Schopenhauer looked into the void and chose to retreat. Nietzsche also saw that same void, the same nihilism, but he refused to answer it with denial. Where Schopenhauer saw a flaw in existence, Nietzsche saw an open field for creation. That's why he broke away from Schopenhauer and from Wagner, like someone letting go of old gods to discover his own truth. He didn't want comfort. He wanted power. Both faced the same shadow, the absence of meaning. But while one went silent in front of it, the other screamed for life. Schopenhauer chose renunciation. Nietzsche chose creation. Imagine that behind everything that exists, every gesture, every thought, every heartbeat, there's a blind, silent, and endless force pushing everything forward, with no reason or direction. For Arthur Schopenhauer, that's the essence of reality. In his most influential work, The World as Will and Representation, 1818, he argues that the world is driven by an irrational will, a kind of raw energy that makes us want, fight, suffer, and repeat it all, endlessly. For Schopenhauer, the will isn't a conscious choice. It's not what we want rationally. It's a primitive drive that comes before reason. It moves us, but it has no idea where it's going. We want because we're alive. And to be alive, he says, is to be endlessly dissatisfied. Think about it. How many times have you felt empty even after getting something you really wanted? How many times have you reached a goal only to immediately chase another? For Schopenhauer, that's not just some psychological glitch. That's the way the world works. Wanting is how reality expresses itself. And that's why life is, at its core, suffering. Because to want is to suffer. The will is blind because it has no purpose. It just wants to keep wanting. And it's insatiable, because as soon as one desire is fulfilled, another takes its place. We're trapped in a cycle of endless craving, with no real rest. The world, seen this way, is a loop of frustration and unrest. And we, poor humans, are stuck in this machine with no way out. And then comes Nietzsche, a bolt of lightning in a cloudy sky. Nietzsche didn't accept the idea that the will is something negative by nature. To him, the will shouldn't be rejected. It should be understood, embraced, and transformed. His response to Schopenhauer was clear. Yes, there is something like a will behind reality, but it's not just suffering, it's also creation, growth, and strength. He called it the will to power. But what is this will to power? It's not about controlling others or chasing wealth, like people often think. For Nietzsche, the will to power is the drive that pushes us to go beyond our limits, to create our own values, to become something greater than we are now. It's the life force that pushes us not just to survive, but to embrace life, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Nietzsche looks at the same raw reality as Schopenhauer, pain, chaos, injustice, but gives a different answer. Don't run from life, dance with it. Where Schopenhauer sees the will as a prison, Nietzsche sees it as the engine of freedom. While one says, resign, reject your desires, seek silence, the other shouts, own your desires, turn chaos into creation, become who you are. That difference changes everything. Schopenhauer believed that to escape the suffering caused by the will, we have to deny the will itself, like saints, ascetics, and mystics. He admired Buddhism for that. We have to quiet the will, he said, to find peace. Nietzsche saw that as a cowardly retreat from life. To him, denying the will is a sickness, a symptom of decay. He wrote, "Man doesn't seek happiness, man seeks power, not in the sense of domination, but of growth, expansion, affirmation." And here we reach the core question: why is living without meaning so dangerous? Because for Schopenhauer, the world has no built-in meaning, and that can make life feel like a heavy burden. If everything is just a cycle of frustrated desires, then existence feels like a mistake. The only way to deal with it is to silence the impulses and numb ourselves to our own will. Nietzsche, on the other hand, also believed the world has no given meaning. But that's not a reason to despair. It's a call to create. If nothing is given, everything is possible. If the universe is indifferent, we're free to give it meaning. The danger lies in not claiming that freedom, in hiding behind fear or the comfort of denial. Nihilism, for Nietzsche, is the price of truth, but also the starting point of transformation. So think, what drives you? What pushes you to get out of bed, to fight, to create, to keep going? Is it just the automatic repetition of desires you never really chose? Or is it something more? A purpose, a vision, a force you can cultivate? What Nietzsche suggests is that you look inward and find not just emptiness, but strength. The will to power is your ability to turn pain into strength, chaos into meaning. It's the fire of life. Ignore it, and you grow numb, suppress it, and you get sick. But nurture it, and you become more than you were yesterday. Schopenhauer points to the abyss. Nietzsche throws you a rope, but not to pull you up, to help you climb it yourself. In the end, the question isn't whether life has meaning, but what you're doing with the force that moves you. Are you suppressing it or transforming it? Close your eyes for a moment and think of a time in your life when you felt pain. Not just physical pain, but the kind that weighs on your soul. The loss of someone, the sting of failure, the emptiness, the anxiety of not knowing what to do with your own existence. These moments leave a mark, and sometimes they define us. But what do they really mean? For Arthur Schopenhauer, they are the very fabric of life. Suffering to him isn't the exception, it's the rule. In his major work, The World as Will and Representation, he puts it plainly: life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom. Suffering, he says, is the natural result of a blind will that constantly craves, but is never satisfied. Schopenhauer invites us to look at life without illusions. We're born with needs. We spend our lives trying to meet those needs, and once we do, boredom sets in. The temporary silence of desire. But soon, something is missing again, and we go back to suffering. We're trapped in what he calls the restless agitation of the will, and pain is the price we pay for being alive. His view is deeply pessimistic, but also deeply honest. He doesn't sugarcoat existence. To him, the world is a harsh place, indifferent to our search for happiness. And the more aware we become, the more we feel the pain of simply existing. The more sensitive, the deeper you think, the more clearly you see, the more you suffer. That's why Schopenhauer suggests renunciation. Reduce your desires, quiet the will, seek peace in beauty, in art, in compassion, all as ways to ease the unavoidable pain of being. He looks at suffering and says, don't fight it, accept it, and step away. Then comes Nietzsche, like a storm tearing down everything that once felt certain. Nietzsche doesn't deny suffering, not at all. He lived it deeply. Health crises, isolation, intense loneliness. But his answer is completely different from Schopenhauer's. For Nietzsche, suffering is not the enemy of life. It's the cost of greatness. You've probably heard the famous quote, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." That's Nietzsche from Twilight of the Idols. And it's not just a catchy phrase, it's the core of his philosophy. Nietzsche believed that pain is necessary for growth, That suffering, when faced head-on, pushes us to evolve, to rise, to become more. But here's the key. He's not romanticizing pain. Nietzsche isn't saying that suffering is good in itself. What he's saying is that since suffering is inevitable, it shouldn't be wasted. It should be transformed into strength, like coal under pressure becoming a diamond. To him, tragedy is the fuel of creation. A suffering soul can create new values, can turn chaos into beauty. Where Schopenhauer wants to overcome suffering through denial, Nietzsche offers something else: transformation. He writes, "You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star." Thus spoke Zarathustra. No chaos, no star. No pain, no breakthrough. This shifts how we deal with life. Think about the hardships you've faced. How many times did pain force you to grow, to change, to mature? Nietzsche would say, life doesn't want to spare you. It wants to shape you. That's the heart of his message. Don't run from pain. Embrace it. Learn from it. Use it to become stronger, more real, more human. Now stop and ask yourself, which of these two visions lives in you? Are you constantly trying to escape pain, like Schopenhauer suggests? Or do you try to use it as fuel, like Nietzsche proposes? Both thinkers agree that suffering is an unavoidable part of life, but the difference lies in how we respond to it. Schopenhauer says, life is suffering. The only wisdom is to silence the will that makes us desire and suffer. Nietzsche replies, yes, life is suffering, but true wisdom is learning to live with it and still dance. Nietzsche dares us to stop being victims of existence. He challenges us to become creators. To him, suffering doesn't destroy us. It's the meaning we give to it that does. And when we give it no meaning at all, that's when it breaks us. That's why living without meaning is so dangerous, because suffering will come. And if there's no deeper purpose behind it, it doesn't transform us. It just crushes us. Schopenhauer saw this and tried to avoid it by rejecting the will. Nietzsche looks into the abyss and says, turn it into strength. In the end, maybe it's not about choosing who's right. Maybe it's about recognizing both forces inside us, one that wants to hide, retreat, go quiet, and another that wants to grow, rise, and scream yes to life, even when it hurts. Suffering is going to knock on your door. That's a fact. The question is, what will you do with it? Have you ever felt like nothing makes sense? Like everything you once believed in, your values, your dreams, your ideas of happiness, was falling apart right in front of you? That feeling, that emptiness, that lack of foundation to keep going, has a name in philosophy: nihilism. Nihilism is the experience of meaninglessness. It's the moment when old values no longer work and no new ones feel worth following. It's a place of deep disillusionment and radical doubt. And more than just a concept, nihilism is a profoundly human and dangerous experience. For Arthur Schopenhauer, nihilism is a response to the unavoidable suffering of life. The will that drives us, according to him, is blind, endless, and drags us through a life full of frustration and pain. So in the face of so much suffering, the big question becomes, is life really worth living? Schopenhauer's answer is harsh but honest: no. Or at least, not the way we live it. Life, to him, is a metaphysical mistake. We're victims of an irrational drive that forces us into existence without our consent. That's why, he says, the only truly wise response is to deny the will to live. This is what we call passive nihilism, a kind of nihilism that doesn't fight, but surrenders. It accepts existential defeat as a kind of relief. For Schopenhauer, the ideal life is one of reduced desire, quiet detachment, aesthetic contemplation, almost like a monk's life. He admires Buddhism, for example, because nirvana represents the extinction of the will, the end of the cycle of birth, desire, and suffering. Schopenhauer sees life as a mistake that should be erased gently. His philosophy is a call for withdrawal, and in a way it can feel comforting. In the face of chaos and pain, some people find peace in this quiet surrender. But Nietzsche sees it completely differently. He looks at the same suffering, the same emptiness, but refuses to bow his head. He calls Schopenhauer's stance a form of decline, a surrender of life. And for Nietzsche, this kind of nihilism isn't medicine, it's poison. Nietzsche sees nihilism as both a danger and a rare opportunity. In books like The Gay Science and Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he describes nihilism like an earthquake. The old values collapse. God is dead. The meanings that once gave structure to life no longer work. But here's the thing. When Nietzsche says God is dead, he's not just talking about organized religion. He's saying that the foundations of meaning in Western culture, morality, truth, cosmic order, have fallen apart. And now what? What's left? What's left is the void. The same void Schopenhauer wanted to silence. But Nietzsche makes a different choice. He stares into the abyss and creates. This is active nihilism, a form of nihilism that doesn't deny the emptiness, but transforms it into fertile ground for new values. Nietzsche doesn't want to run from suffering or escape the pain of living without a why. He wants to move through it, to find a radical affirmation of life on the other side. He writes, "Nihilism is a crossroads. It can lead to decay or to overcoming." For Nietzsche, nihilism is a trial by fire. Those who back down become weak, bitter, sick in spirit. But those who face it, who don't run from the lack of meaning, can emerge stronger, sharper, freer, like a snake shedding its skin, like an artist painting with the ashes of the past. That's why Nietzsche talks about the Overman, Übermensch, not as someone biologically superior, but as someone who creates their own values instead of relying on inherited ones. It's the kind of person who, when faced with nihilism, doesn't fall apart. They reinvent themselves. Now think about your own life. Have you ever gone through a time when everything seemed to fall apart? When your old values stopped making sense? When you felt lost, without direction? If so, then you've already touched nihilism. The real question is, what did you do with it? Did you run, deny it, distract yourself with boredom, comfort, or anything to numb the feeling? Or did you try, even in the darkness, to create a new sense of meaning for yourself? Schopenhauer deeply understands the pain of existence. He offers a kind of comfort, a path to peace through denial. But Nietzsche wants more. He wants you to accept the pain as part of life, and from that harsh ground, build something new. To him, the real danger isn't nihilism itself. The real danger is what you do once you realize nothing has meaning. Do you give up, or do you create? Nietzsche invites us to embrace nihilism, not as an end, but as a beginning. It's like a fire that burns away the old idols, so that from the ashes something truer, something more personal can be born. Active nihilism is that call, a challenge for the brave soul, an invitation to live without guarantees, but with intensity. Because in the end, the meaning of life isn't something you find, it's something you build. Few topics stir up such strong reactions as religion. For many, it's a source of comfort, meaning, and refuge. For others, it feels like a cage, a tool of illusion and control. But in the history of philosophy, two thinkers stand out for their deep and powerful critiques of traditional religion: Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Both saw religion not as divine truth, but as a human creation, born from pain, fear, and the need for meaning. However, they take very different paths when it comes to judging religion's value for life. Even though he was one of Christianity's harshest critics, Schopenhauer wasn't a classic atheist. His issue with Christianity wasn't belief in God itself, but the moral structure it built throughout history: guilt, repression, and the denial of real life. He saw Christianity as a system that, by promising salvation in the future, ended up devaluing the present moment. Still, Schopenhauer didn't reject all forms of spirituality. On the contrary, he deeply admired Buddhism. To him, Buddhism understood the root of human existence, suffering, and more importantly, it offered a way out, not through dogmas or promises of heaven, but through inner practice, the denial of desires, and compassion for other living beings who also suffer. Schopenhauer believed compassion, Mitleid, was the highest moral value, and saw it as a bridge between his philosophy and certain religious traditions. While Christianity imposes moral rules based on fear of hell or promises of salvation, Buddhism, like his philosophy, is grounded in empathy for the suffering of others. In other words, Schopenhauer didn't criticize religion simply for being false, but for being morally harmful when it ignores the truth of suffering and manipulates people with illusions. For him, a religion is only valid if it teaches us to renounce the will, to cultivate compassion, and to face life's pain with dignity. And then comes Friedrich Nietzsche, and the critique becomes far more intense. Nietzsche didn't just criticize Christianity, he accused it of poisoning the human spirit. In works like The Gay Science and especially The Antichrist, Nietzsche launched a brutal attack on what he called the slave morality, promoted by traditional Christianity. But what exactly does that mean? Nietzsche observed that Christianity was born among the weak, the oppressed, the sick, the resentful, and what these people did, according to him, was flip the values of strength, beauty, and vitality, and turn them into sin. Instead of admiring strength, they praised weakness. Instead of affirming life, they glorified suffering. Instead of striving for greatness, they worshipped humility as the highest virtue. This reversal of values, where being good means being poor, obedient, and submissive, is what Nietzsche called reactive revaluation. It's the triumph of resentment. Religion, in this view, isn't a source of wisdom. It's a tool of domestication. It turns men into sheep, and worse, it makes them proud to be sheep. Nietzsche argued that this Christian morality denies life, weakens the body, represses instincts, and turns what is natural into sin. And all of it comes with the promise of a future life, a heaven that never arrives, while real life becomes dull, repressed, and colorless. That's the context in which he famously said, "God is dead." This isn't a celebration. It's not just a provocation. It's a cultural diagnosis. Nietzsche saw that even though people still claim to believe in God, the values that used to be built on that belief, goodness, truth, morality, the meaning of life, no longer had a solid foundation. We're living among ruins, so what happens when God dies? Nihilism, the collapse of all inherited meaning, takes over. Nietzsche knew that the death of God wouldn't set people free. It would leave them lost. That's why his message isn't just about destruction. It's about rebuilding, creating new values, forging a new kind of morality, not one based on fear, but on life's raw power. While Schopenhauer saw compassion as the heart of ethics and found value in Eastern spirituality as a path to ease suffering, Nietzsche rejected any system that weakened human beings by denying life. To him, true spirituality affirms life, with all its tragedy and beauty. Nietzsche called for the replacement of the religious man with the creative man, someone who no longer needs dogma to live, because they create their own meaning. That is the Übermensch, not a tyrant, but someone who lives with intensity, sees the world clearly, and still says yes to life. And this brings us to a deeper question. What are we really searching for when we turn to religion? Comfort, truth, strength, reward? Schopenhauer might say we're trying to find a way to cope with suffering. Nietzsche would say we're trying to run from it, when we should be facing it head on. Maybe religion doesn't have to die, but it does need to be reinvented. A spirituality that doesn't weaken us, but deepens us. One that doesn't treat us like children with easy promises, but challenges us to live with courage. One that doesn't deny pain, but helps us turn it into strength. Because as Nietzsche reminds us, faith means not wanting to know the truth. Me, And as Schopenhauer points out, compassion is the basis of morality. Now it's up to you to decide. Will you live under the weight of imposed values, or will you search for a new way of being, more conscious, more free, more true? There are moments in life when everything seems to fall apart. Words fail, reason runs out, and the world feels too dark to bear. But then, a melody plays. A painting stops us in our tracks. A poem cuts through us. And for a few seconds, just a few, the pain goes quiet. That's the power of art. And both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche recognize this power, though in very different ways. For Arthur Schopenhauer, art is a sacred refuge from the pain of existence. In his philosophy, as we've seen, life is driven by an irrational will, an endless force that makes us want, suffer, and become frustrated again and again. We're trapped by this will. We can't turn it off. That's why, according to him, existence is suffering at its core. But there are rare moments when we manage to escape that cycle. Moments when, for a brief instant, we stop wanting, stop striving, stop needing. And in those moments, we contemplate. That's where art comes in. For Schopenhauer, art is the temporary suspension of the will. When we experience a work of art, hear a symphony, read a powerful poem, or lose ourselves in the beauty of a painting, something shifts. We stop being desiring individuals and become pure observers. Reality is still there. The world is still full of pain. But for a short while, art lifts us out of the cycle of wanting. It brings us into a space where time and self disappear. And among all the forms of art, Schopenhauer highlights one above the rest: music. Music, he says, is the purest and most direct form of art because it doesn't represent the world. It is the will itself. It speaks directly to the core of reality, without using images or concepts. That's why music can move us even if we don't understand the words or know the story. It touches something deeper, something that exists before language. For Schopenhauer, art is redemptive because it offers relief, even if only temporary. It doesn't change the world. It doesn't erase suffering, but it gives us a moment of inner freedom, a chance to breathe outside the weight of the will. His view of art is contemplative, almost spiritual, a pause in the pain, like a patch of shade in the middle of a desert. But for Nietzsche, that's not enough. Nietzsche also sees art as a kind of redemption, but for him, art isn't an escape, it's an act of affirmation. If Schopenhauer uses art to withdraw from life, Nietzsche uses it to embrace life with even greater force. In his first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche proposes two fundamental forces in art: the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The Apollonian is order, structure, clarity. It's the art of harmony, of reason, of beautiful illusions that hide the chaos of the world. The Dionysian, on the other hand, is ecstasy, raw energy, excess. It's the art of intoxication, of celebration, of breaking boundaries. It's the kind of art that welcomes chaos and turns pain into dance. And Nietzsche believed that the real power of art lies in the Dionysian. Greek tragedy, especially in the works of Aeschylus and Sophocles, was, for him, the height of this fusion between chaos and form. The Greeks didn't deny suffering. On the contrary, they put it center stage and made it bearable through music, beauty, and rhythm. For Nietzsche, art doesn't exist to comfort us in the face of suffering. It exists to give it meaning, to allow us, even in the face of the absurd, to say, yes, I want to live it all again. See the difference? Schopenhauer uses art as a temporary relief from the pain of living. Nietzsche uses it as a creative explosion that transforms pain into power. To him, art is a higher form of spiritual health. It's how we humans affirm life, even in its cruelty. That's why he writes, We have art in order not to die of the truth. The truth that life is suffering, that the universe is indifferent, that nothing is guaranteed, could crush us. But art saves us, not by numbing us, but by making us strong enough to face the truth and still sing. Nietzsche dreamed of a culture that teaches people to dance on the edge of the abyss, one that doesn't hide suffering, but turns it into something beautiful. Dionysian art doesn't comfort, it strengthens. And here's the key point. Living without art is dangerous, because art is how we turn pain into beauty. Without it, suffering crushes us. With it, suffering can lift us up. Think about the times a song saved you. A film gave you courage. A book made you feel less alone. That wasn't just entertainment. That was survival. That was transformation. Art is a form of resistance against nihilism, against emptiness, against the temptation to give up. For Schopenhauer, it's refuge. For Nietzsche, it's celebration. For us, maybe it's both. Life, after all, is hard. But if you look at it through an artistic lens, if you feel it as a work in progress, then it can become bearable, admirable, even desirable. And you? What do you do with your pain? Do you suppress it? Or do you turn it into creation? If you saw someone collapsed on the street, hurt, crying, what would you do? That urge to help, that pain you feel when seeing someone else in pain, that's what we call compassion. For many, compassion is the most noble part of being human. A quiet gesture that connects people in suffering. An invisible thread that cuts through ego and lets us feel with someone else, as if we were them. But is that enough to build an ethical life? Or could this empathy, so often celebrated, actually be hiding something dangerous? Between Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, we find two radically different answers, and understanding this tension forces us to ask, what is true goodness? For Arthur Schopenhauer, compassion is the only true foundation of morality. He rejects moral systems based on religious commandments, social contracts, or utility. To him, real morality doesn't come from reason, or duty, or personal gain. It comes from a deep, emotional connection to the suffering of others. In his book, On the Basis of Morality, Schopenhauer argues that the only truly moral act is one that comes from genuine compassion, when we help someone not for a reward, not because we were taught to, but because we actually feel their pain as if it were our own. In that moment, he says, something rare and powerful happens. The ego disappears for a second. The will, that blind drive that makes us selfish, competitive, and cruel, is momentarily silenced. What's left is a shared pain, a common humanity. That's why compassion, for Schopenhauer, is the purest form of ethics. It doesn't need rules. It doesn't need dogma. It's a direct experience of someone else's pain, and that's where moral duty begins. True kindness, he says, isn't about being a hero. It's about being deeply sensitive, a soul that suffers with the world. Then comes Nietzsche and blows this idea to pieces. Nietzsche looks at compassion with suspicion and fierce criticism. He asks, is compassion really noble? Or is it just a disguised way of denying life, a form of weakness dressed up as virtue? For Nietzsche, compassion can easily turn into degeneration. He believed that our modern obsession with empathy and care often serves to protect the weak, block the strong from growing, and smother the power of life in the name of pity. In books like The Antichrist and On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche exposes what he calls slave morality, a moral system built on resentment, where weakness is turned into virtue. In his view, the glorification of compassion, so central in Christianity and much of Western moral thought, is a strategy the weak use to control the strong. He writes sharply, compassion stands in the way of nature's law, the survival of the fittest, and adds, compassion preserves what is decaying. For Nietzsche, life is about struggle, growth, and becoming stronger. Existence is tragic, and we must have the strength to affirm it anyway. In that context, compassion can become a way of weakening our most vital instincts. It can stop people from learning through pain. It can stop people from facing their own challenges. It can hold back the evolution of the world, all in the name of fake kindness. Nietzsche wasn't against caring for others, but he was against making compassion the highest moral rule. For him, idolizing other people's pain brings everything down to the lowest level. Everything strong, bold, and creative starts being seen as arrogant or immoral. Everything weak, fragile, submissive is suddenly called virtue. That's why Nietzsche calls for a revaluation of values. He wants to flip the flip, not to celebrate cruelty, but to bring back strength, life, and excellence. Now pause and think. What place does compassion have in your life? Do you act out of real empathy, or because it makes you feel morally superior? Do you help others because you understand them, or because you're afraid of facing your own discomfort? Schopenhauer would say, compassion is the only path to true morality. Nietzsche would reply, compassion might just be fear disguised as virtue, fear of pain, struggle, and greatness. Maybe the tension between them isn't about compassion itself, but about what it means. To Schopenhauer, it's letting go of the ego. To Nietzsche, it could be a denial of our potential. The first believes that ethics is born from identifying with others. The second believes true ethics is born from the ability to affirm life, even in its harshest form. So here's the real question. How do we live ethically in a world where everyone suffers? Schopenhauer's answer, suffer with them. Nietzsche's answer, teach them to turn suffering into strength. Maybe we don't need to fully pick sides. Maybe true wisdom is knowing there's a time for compassion and a time for courage, a time to comfort and a time to challenge, a time to feel with someone and a time to push them to grow. Compassion is, without a doubt, one of life's most beautiful experiences. But like every human force, it can either lift us up or hold us back. It all depends on how we live it. And you? Does your compassion set people free or hold them down? What makes someone a genius? Is it superior intelligence, extraordinary creativity? Or is it something deeper? Something about how a person sees the world and responds to life itself? For Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, a genius isn't just someone talented. They're a rare, almost mythical figure who represents a unique way of existing. And what each of them values in a genius reveals what they truly believe about the meaning of life. Let's start with Arthur Schopenhauer. To him, a genius is someone who can suspend their will. Remember, in Schopenhauer's philosophy, suffering comes from endless desire. Everyday life is a constant struggle to satisfy the will, that blind force that drives us without rest. The average person is stuck in this loop of wanting, suffering, and wanting again. The genius, however, is the exception. They're the one who can step outside of that cycle, even if only briefly, and observe the world as pure representation. They don't see the world as something to use, possess, or conquer, but as something to understand, to feel, to witness. A genius, according to Schopenhauer, is deeply contemplative. They don't act to change reality, they express it. That's why many geniuses emerge through art, music, or literature, because these forms allow them to capture the essence of the world without being caught up in the will. Think of someone like Beethoven. Even after going deaf, he continued to compose. To Schopenhauer, that's not just talent. It's a level of consciousness that rises above desire. It becomes a mirror of the world itself. The artistic genius, then, is closer to truth because they see the world without filters, without personal interests, without ego. But the price is high. In this view, the genius doesn't belong to the practical world. They're often misunderstood, isolated, melancholic. Their greatness lies in their ability to contemplate. But that same ability pulls them away from everyday life, simple pleasures, and emotional stability. Genius becomes a burden, a heightened awareness that brings more pain than joy. And yet, it's through them that we get the most sublime moments in human culture. Nietzsche, on the other hand, completely flips that image. To him, a true genius isn't someone who just sees the world. It's someone who dares to recreate it. The genius is a creator of values. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche introduces the idea of the Übermensch, the overman, a symbolic figure who rises above traditional morality, breaks free from inherited values, and carves out new paths. That's where his vision of genius comes in. The genius for Nietzsche is someone who refuses to obey what's already been labeled as good or evil. They look at everything society calls sacred, untouchable, unquestionable, and ask, does this still make sense? And if it doesn't, they break away. They create. They reinvent. This kind of genius is a free spirit, someone brave enough to tear down their inner idols, God, morality, guilt, duty. And in the empty space left behind, they build something new. He writes, "What is the great human? One who creates values." Unlike Schopenhauer's genius, Nietzsche's doesn't retreat from life to observe it. He dives into it. He feels the chaos and still finds the strength to give it shape. For Nietzsche, genius is about affirming life, even when life is tragic, even when nothing makes sense. The genius is the one who looks into the abyss, smiles and says, "I will create." But that path is lonely too, maybe even lonelier than Schopenhauer's, because creating new values means being misunderstood, rejected, attacked. The Nietzschean genius is like a prophet born before their time, speaking a language no one else has learned yet. And often, they pay a heavy price for their vision. Nietzsche knew this. He lived it. His life was marked by isolation, illness, and rejection. And still, he kept writing, questioning, provoking, because he believed true genius doesn't chase approval. It stays loyal to itself, and that's the heart of this lesson. To Schopenhauer, a genius is someone who steps away from desire and sees the world with clarity. To Nietzsche, a genius is someone who transforms the world and gives life new meaning. One sees genius as a gift of perception. The other sees it as a gift of creation. And us? What do we do with that? We live in a time that celebrates quick talent, easy answers, and surface-level brilliance. But true genius, the kind that transforms the world or reveals its deepest truths, is rare, deeper, and more painful. Maybe today, the challenge isn't just to admire geniuses, but to dare to become one. Not in the sense of being better than others, but in the sense of radical authenticity. Breaking free from borrowed values, learning to truly contemplate or courageously create, saying no to what no longer serves, and saying yes to what pulses inside you, even if no one else understands it. Because the world doesn't just need more smart people, it needs more visionaries, more creators, more humans willing to live not as copies, but as original works of art. What's the right thing to do? Why should we act morally? And maybe the most unsettling question of all, who decided what's good and bad in the first place? These questions have shaped human existence forever. They sit at the heart of our laws, religions, cultures, and of course, philosophy. But the answers given by Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche don't just differ, they completely clash as two opposing worldviews. For Schopenhauer, true morality doesn't come from outside sources like religion, society, or logic. It comes from within, from a deep emotional experience, empathy. Remember, in Schopenhauer's philosophy, the world is driven by a blind, endless will that causes us to constantly desire and suffer. The average person is trapped in this cycle, living out of self-interest, instinct, and ego. But there are rare moments and rare people who can break free, even briefly. People who feel the pain of others as if it were their own. And it's in this quiet, spontaneous response that true morality is born. For him, all genuine ethics are based on compassion, or, as he preferred to call it, Mitleid, literally, suffering with. This ability to identify with someone else's suffering is the only thing that can interrupt the ego's grip. That's why Schopenhauer says, every moral action is a denial of the will. To act morally, in his view, is not to obey a rule, but to renounce your own desire for the sake of someone else's well-being. And this includes all sentient beings, not just humans, but animals too. Morality, then, is universal. It extends to any creature capable of suffering. From this, Schopenhauer builds his ethical ideal: reduce the suffering in the world by giving up selfishness and living a life of compassion and restraint. It's a deeply humanistic vision, but one that also carries a certain pessimism. Morality becomes a form of resistance, a refusal to go along with the will, which is the source of suffering. That's why, in Schopenhauer's view, the moral person is almost saint-like, someone who transcends the natural drive of life to reach a kind of quiet peace. Then comes Nietzsche and flips the entire idea upside down. Nietzsche doesn't believe morality is universal. He doesn't see compassion as the highest virtue. And most importantly, he doesn't think good is something eternal or absolute. For him, morality is a human invention, a historical construction. It doesn't come from God or reason or some inner human essence. It comes from power struggles, cultural battles, resentment and conflict. And like all historical things, it changes and should be questioned. In his book On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche traces what he calls the birth of slave morality. And this is where his sharpest critique begins. According to Nietzsche, in ancient societies, good and bad had very different meanings. Good was the noble, the strong, the life-affirming person, someone who lived with courage, instinct, and intensity. Bad was just the opposite, the weak, the cowardly, the mediocre. Morality, in this world, came from strength and vitality. This was what Nietzsche called master morality. But over time, the weak, the resentful, the powerless, the oppressed, started flipping the script. They began saying, the strong are evil because they're cruel, and we, the weak, are good because we're humble, obedient, compassionate. And this gave birth to slave morality, a system based on resentment, where weakness is turned into virtue and strength into sin. Nietzsche writes, slave morality begins when the weak say to the strong, you are evil. For the slave, good is whatever reduces suffering, comforts, or protects. It's within this idea that Nietzsche places his critique of compassion. To him, compassion isn't virtue, it's weakness. It holds back progress. It prevents people from rising above themselves. It softens the necessary hardness required for greatness. While Schopenhauer sees morality as overcoming the ego through empathy, Nietzsche sees traditional morality as a prison dressed up as virtue. He writes, Christian morality is the morality of the sick. Compassion paralyzes the will to power. So Nietzsche proposes a revaluation of values. He wants to break from the morality we've inherited and build a new one, not based on traditional ideas of good and evil, but on affirming life. The new human, the Übermensch, is someone who creates their own values, free from resentment, free from fear, without needing to justify their strength through fake humility. Now think about it. Where do your values come from? Do you act out of empathy? Out of duty? Out of fear of being judged? Or have you ever stopped to ask yourself where your sense of morality even came from? Schopenhauer would say your moral compass should be universal compassion, a deep feeling of solidarity with every creature that suffers. Nietzsche, on the other hand, would ask, is that compass truly yours? Or was it handed to you by a culture afraid of freedom? At its core, this lesson isn't just about morality. It's about autonomy, about the courage to do what's right and know why you're doing it, about recognizing the pain of others, but also recognizing your own strength, about compassion without cowardice, and greatness without arrogance. In the end, morality isn't a list of rules. It's a living choice. So what about you? Will you live by the values you inherited, or will you create your own? Have you ever wondered if you're truly free? When you make a decision, like quitting your job, ending a relationship, getting out of bed, or even choosing what to eat for breakfast, it feels like you made that choice, right? But what if I told you that, according to some of philosophy's greatest thinkers, that feeling of freedom is just a very convincing illusion? That's the challenge running through the work of Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche. Both reject the traditional idea of free will, but for very different reasons, with very different consequences. Let's start with Schopenhauer, whose view is as unsettling as it is consistent with his philosophy of suffering. In his book on the freedom of the human will, Schopenhauer states, without hesitation, "A person can do what they will, but they cannot will what they will." That one line says it all. For him, the will is the true engine of the world, an irrational, blind, and endless force that drives us toward desire, struggle, and pain. And we, as human beings, are just expressions of that will. We think we're making free choices, but we're actually being pushed by inner motives we don't control. Our preferences, tendencies, past experiences, traumas, and desires, they shape us long before reason ever steps in. So, when you think you're choosing something rationally, that decision was already made inside you. Reason, according to Schopenhauer, is like a secretary, justifying decisions that the will already made behind the scenes. In other words, we're not as in charge of our lives as we think we are. So what does that mean? It means traditional moral responsibility starts to fall apart. We're not evil because we choose to be, and we're not virtuous because we will it. We are who we are because the will made us that way. The killer, the saint, the poet, the coward, they're all just different expressions of the same blind force behind all existence. Schopenhauer isn't saying this to justify evil. He's trying to expose the illusion of autonomy. We are determined, and the most we can do is recognize this and try to weaken the grip of the will through things like aesthetic contemplation, compassion, and the voluntary denial of desire. Then comes Nietzsche, and the critique of free will continues, but takes a totally different turn. Nietzsche also sees free will as a fiction, but he believes it's a useful fiction, created by morality and religion to make people feel guilty and easy to control. He writes, "Free will was invented mainly for the purpose of punishment, so we could hold people accountable and condemn them." For Nietzsche, the belief that we freely choose our actions is what supports entire systems of guilt, punishment, and reward. It's a tool of domination, especially in Christianity, which teaches that people freely choose between good and evil, and therefore deserve heaven or hell. Nietzsche tears that idea apart. He argues that our will isn't singular, free, or stable. Quite the opposite. It's multiple, fragmented, and often contradictory. Inside us, there isn't one unified self making conscious decisions like a king on a throne. There's a constant conflict, a storm of impulses, emotions, instincts, and desires fighting for control. The will is a battlefield, not a straight path. So where does freedom come in? Nietzsche offers a powerful idea. True freedom isn't about making choices in a totally free way. It's about learning how to shape your inner chaos. The higher human, the one who evolves, is the person who can affirm their will within the chaos. They're not free in the traditional sense, but they're strong enough to give form to their own disorder. He writes, "Become who you are." That's the real challenge. And that's only possible when we stop fooling ourselves with romantic ideas of free will and start facing what we really are, a field of forces, a continuous struggle. Nietzsche's path is one of self-affirmation, not based on total freedom, but on the ability to shape your life with awareness, courage, and style. And that's where he and Schopenhauer completely split. Schopenhauer looks at the will and says, deny it. Nietzsche looks at the same will and says, affirm it, master it, transform it. One seeks freedom through renunciation. The other seeks it through creative power. For Schopenhauer, free will is an illusion hiding our slavery to desire. For Nietzsche, it's an illusion hiding the possibility of becoming our own master. Not because we're free, but because we're strong. And that leads us to a question that could change everything. Are you actually in control of your life? Or just rationalizing your impulses? Do you act from conscious choice? Or are your fears, desires, and resentments in the driver's seat, while you just stare out the window? Philosophy invites us to stop and listen to what really drives us. And even more than that, to live in a way that lets us shape, choose, resist, and create, even if full freedom doesn't exist. Because even if free will is an illusion, the responsibility to live consciously is still ours. Schopenhauer teaches humility, knowing how little we control. Nietzsche challenges us to rise, even without full control. Both tear us out of our comfort zone, but each one points us in a different direction. So now, what about you? Will you deny the will or learn to dance with it? Imagine someone who gives up pleasure, distances themselves from passion, and chooses to live with the bare minimum, in silence, solitude, and discipline. A monk, a hermit, a sage. What is that person searching for? Peace, enlightenment, freedom, or are they simply running away from life? The answer depends on who you ask. For Arthur Schopenhauer, asceticism is one of the highest paths a human being can take. For Friedrich Nietzsche, it's one of the clearest signs of life denial. Two giants in philosophy, two radically opposite views. Let's explore why. Schopenhauer begins his reflection on asceticism with a basic belief: life is suffering, we're constantly wanting, and to want is to feel lack. Pleasure is short, pain is constant. We live trapped by a blind will that drives us without rest. And the worst part, the more conscious we become, the more we feel the weight of existence. So what's left? Schopenhauer offers two paths. The first is the path of art and contemplation, which offers temporary relief from the will. The second is deeper, more radical, the path of asceticism. To him, the ascetic is someone who has understood the essence of existence and chooses to turn away from the world of desires. They're not repressing out of guilt. They're silencing the will voluntarily, knowing that every act of wanting leads to suffering. The ascetic gives up pleasure not because they feel ashamed, but because they've gained wisdom. They don't hate the body. They understand that the body is the vehicle of desire. They're not chasing a heavenly reward. They're seeking inner freedom. Schopenhauer deeply admired religious traditions that valued asceticism, especially Buddhism, which teaches that ending desire is the path to nirvana, and even elements of early Christianity that praised humility, fasting, and celibacy. In his view, the ascetic is a spiritual hero, not a martyr, but someone who has overcome the slavery of the will, someone who discovered that less is more, that silence is richness, and that renunciation is a powerful inner act. But when we turn to Nietzsche, the perspective shifts dramatically. Nietzsche looks at asceticism, this choice to renounce life, pleasure, and desire, and sees something dangerous. On the genealogy of morality, he delivers a fierce critique of what he calls the ascetic ideal. For him, asceticism is not a sign of elevation, it's a sign of decay. The ascetic ideal, according to Nietzsche, is born out of resentment. It arises when people can no longer embrace life as it is, with its instincts, pain, and contradictions, and instead build a morality that says, all of this is sin. All of this must be denied. Instead of accepting life as a creative force, as a flow of energy, the ascetic ideal teaches, deny yourself, reject your body, abandon your desires, live only for the soul. Nietzsche sees this as a trap, a form of self-punishment disguised as virtue. To him, the ascetic isn't strong for renouncing. They're too weak to endure the intensity of life. He writes, life ends where the ascetic ideal begins. The problem, Nietzsche argues, is that this ideal infected Western culture. from early Christianity to philosophers who praised reason over the body, to modern moralists who view pleasure with suspicion, all of them, in Nietzsche's eyes, are ruled by a morality that denies life in favor of some beyond. But Nietzsche wants the opposite, a life-affirming morality, an ethic of the body, of desire, of creation. He doesn't want pure souls floating above the world. He wants real bodies dancing in the world, even when it hurts. And here lies the true clash between these two thinkers. Schopenhauer sees asceticism as the height of wisdom. Nietzsche sees it as the height of weakness. One believes that denying desire leads to inner freedom. The other believes that same denial is the root of nihilism, sickness, and decay. To Schopenhauer, the ascetic rises. To Nietzsche, the ascetic shrinks. So what about us? What role does renunciation play in our lives? We live in a culture that glorifies consumption, speed, and instant pleasure. In that world, asceticism can seem outdated, even absurd. But maybe it's not. Maybe Schopenhauer is reminding us that there's wisdom in saying no to excess, in turning down the noise, in learning how to be at peace without needing everything. And maybe Nietzsche is warning us, if that no turns into hatred toward life, then it's no longer wisdom, it's fear. So here's the real question. When you give something up, are you setting yourself free, or are you hiding? Asceticism can be strength or weakness. It all depends on the intention. Giving something up out of clarity is different from giving it up out of fear. Saying no to desire out of self-mastery is different from saying no because of guilt or shame. Nietzsche doesn't reject discipline, but he believes discipline should serve life, not deny it. Schopenhauer doesn't dismiss the beauty of the world, but he sees it as only a pause, and believes true freedom lies in silencing the will. Maybe the real path is somewhere in between, not in total surrender to desire, not in total rejection of it either, but in knowing when to say yes and when to say no. In the end, asceticism isn't just for monks. It's a question for all of us. What do you truly need to live well? Have you ever felt like life is just too heavy? Like there's a quiet burden behind everyday life? A sense that things could or should be different? For Arthur Schopenhauer, that feeling isn't an accident. It's the truth about existence. His philosophy is rooted in radical pessimism. He doesn't try to hide or soften the pain of living. In fact, he puts suffering right at the center. To Schopenhauer, life is a metaphysical mistake. Yes, you read that right. A mistake. In his book, The World as Will and Representation, he argues that the world is driven by a blind, irrational, and endless force, the will. A restless energy that makes us want things over and over again without ever truly being satisfied. We desire, we suffer, and when we finally get what we want, we get bored. So we start desiring again. It's a never-ending cycle. He once wrote, "Life is a business that doesn't cover its costs." In other words, pain outweighs pleasure. Suffering is more constant than joy. Life is, at its core, a pointless struggle against a force that never stops. The only redemption, according to Schopenhauer, is to reduce our desires, and ideally, to deny the will to live altogether. He admired spiritual paths like Buddhism for promoting detachment and the end of suffering. At the heart of it, his ethical and existential ideal is renunciation, silence, letting go of the will. This view is harsh, melancholic, but for many, it's also brutally honest. Schopenhauer doesn't offer easy comfort. He demands courage to face the world as it really is, tragic, indifferent, and often cruel. Nietzsche agrees with the diagnosis, but completely rejects the conclusion. Yes, life is tragic. Yes, suffering is unavoidable. Yes, there's no ultimate meaning written into the universe. But that doesn't mean life is a mistake. On the contrary, it means life is a one-of-a-kind opportunity, and it should be embraced fully. That's the spirit behind one of Nietzsche's most powerful ideas, Amor fati. Amor fati literally means love of fate, but it's not about passive resignation, not accepting life with cold indifference or fatalism. It's something much deeper, loving life exactly as it is, with all its pain, its flaws, its failures, its cycles, with everything you didn't choose, yet still shaped who you are. Nietzsche writes, "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely to bear what is necessary, but to love it." That kind of strength is very different from the kind that looks for comfort. It means being able to say yes even to the pain, the loss, and the moments that don't make sense. It means looking at the hardest parts of your life and still not wishing they were different. Nietzsche flips Schopenhauer's pessimism on its head. Where Schopenhauer sees mistake, Nietzsche sees opportunity. Where there's tragedy, Nietzsche sees room for creation. Where there's pain, Nietzsche sees the soil where the soul can grow if it has courage. Amor fati is, in that sense, an ethic of affirming life. And despite what it may sound like, it doesn't require life to be good. It asks that you become strong enough to embrace it, even when it's not. Nietzsche doesn't want to comfort you. He wants to wake you up. He doesn't want you to run from life. He wants you to be transformed by it. And that's the real contrast between the two thinkers. Schopenhauer teaches us to recognize pain as the essence of life and to overcome it by denying the will. Nietzsche accepts the same pain, but invites us to affirm the will even in the face of absurdity. One says, "Life is a mistake." The other replies, "Life is a risk." And that's exactly what makes it worth it. But what does that mean for you? How many times have you wished your life were different? That certain chapters could be erased? That some of your pain had never happened? Nietzsche asks, what if instead of erasing, you learned to say, "Yes, it was hard, but it brought me here. I accept it. I embrace it. I love it." That's amor fati. It's not easy, but it's freeing. Because while pessimism paralyzes you, amor fati moves you forward. While pessimism invites silence, amor fati invites you to dance. While pessimism says, "Deny life," amor fati shouts, "Affirm it, all of it." And maybe that's the hardest choice of all. Not between right and wrong, but between running away from life or living it all the way, with intensity and courage. In the end, both pessimism and amor fati bring us to the same question. How will you face the fact that life offers no guarantees? Schopenhauer says, withdraw, deny, stay silent. Nietzsche says, embrace, create, affirm. And you? Will you mourn the world for what it isn't? Or will you learn to say yes, even when every part of you wants to say no? Imagine for a moment that everything you've lived, every joy, every pain, every choice, every regret, had to be repeated over and over, down to the smallest detail, and not just once. You would have to live this exact same life, exactly as it happened, again and again, for all eternity. Would you accept that fate? Or would the idea drive you to despair? This is the challenge behind one of Friedrich Nietzsche's most mysterious and powerful ideas, the eternal return. At first glance, it sounds simple, but it hides a bottomless depth. To understand Nietzsche's idea, you have to start where he starts, with the awareness that life is tragic, full of pain, chaos, and contradiction. And yet, he insists that the meaning of life is not in escaping it, but in embracing it fully. The eternal return is the ultimate test of that embrace. Nietzsche introduces this idea in The Gay Science, and later expands it in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He suggests that if the universe is finite and time is infinite, then everything that happens must happen again, endlessly, in exactly the same way. It's not reincarnation, it's not evolution, it's literal repetition. But Nietzsche isn't talking about physics or cosmology. This is an ethical and existential question. He presents it as a challenge to your soul. What if one day or night a demon were to creep up to you in your loneliest solitude and say, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. And there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy, every thought and sigh, all will return to you in the same sequence." And then he asks, would you collapse to the ground and curse this demon? Or would you embrace him as a divine messenger? Your answer reveals how much you value your own life. If you truly love life, with all its flaws, the eternal return becomes a cosmic yes, the ultimate celebration. But if you hate your life, if you live full of regret, resentment, or guilt, then the eternal return becomes an eternal punishment. Nietzsche presents this as the highest standard of spiritual strength. The person who can say yes to the eternal return is the one who affirms life completely, without needing it to be perfect, fair, or redeemed. Now, compare this with Arthur Schopenhauer, and you'll see one of the sharpest contrasts in all of modern philosophy. Schopenhauer never talks about eternal return, but his view of time and existence is deeply cyclical and pessimistic. For him, life is like a wheel spinning endlessly, driven by blind will. Nothing truly new ever happens. We desire, we suffer, we get frustrated, and then it starts all over again. Pain repeats. Boredom returns. The cycle never breaks. But unlike Nietzsche, Schopenhauer doesn't see this repetition as a moral test. He doesn't ask whether you could love life as it is. He simply declares that this cycle is a curse. In his philosophy, time brings no redemption, only repeated exposure to suffering. And the human being, trapped in the illusion of progress or novelty, stays enslaved to the same basic structure, to want, to be frustrated, and to want again. So Schopenhauer's ideal isn't to affirm life, but to suspend the cycle. The only real salvation, he says, is to deny the will to live, to break free from the flow of desire, to consciously fade away, and finally exit the wheel. Nietzsche refuses this conclusion. To him, denying life is a sign of weakness, a coward's surrender. He believes the only noble path is the opposite, to embrace life with all its absurdity and dance with it anyway. That's why the eternal return isn't a belief. It's a trial by fire. It asks, are you living in a way that you'd be willing to repeat forever? If your answer is no, Nietzsche doesn't judge you, but he does challenge you. Maybe you're wasting the one chance you have to live with more presence, more courage, more authenticity. In Nietzsche's view, there's no afterlife, no future paradise, no final justice. The only eternity is this life, lived over and over again. And if that's true, or even if it's just a thought experiment, then what you do with your time takes on a whole new weight. Nietzsche wants us to live with such intensity, such integrity, that each moment is worthy of being repeated. That we don't need some meaning outside of life, because living itself becomes enough. This is the spirit of Amor fati, which we explored in the last lesson. Not just accepting your fate, but loving it. The eternal return is the ultimate test of that love. And here lies the final contrast between the two thinkers. For Schopenhauer, time is the repetition of suffering, and freedom lies in escaping the cycle. For Nietzsche, time is the mirror of eternity, and freedom lies in joyfully affirming the cycle. One sees despair in repetition. The other sees a chance to become eternal. And you? Are you living a life you'd want to repeat forever? If the answer is no, maybe you don't need to change the universe. Maybe you just need to change how you choose to live today. Have you ever stopped to think that maybe the world as you see it isn't really how the world is? That everything you experience, sounds, colors, smells, ideas, isn't reality itself, but something your mind builds? This question runs through centuries of philosophy, and it becomes especially powerful in the work of two thinkers who, despite their differences, share a striking belief. We never have direct access to reality. Both Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche believe the world we see, feel, and understand is always filtered, shaped, and interpreted. But each one approaches this idea from a radically different starting point. Let's begin with Schopenhauer. His philosophy was heavily influenced by Immanuel Kant, who revolutionized how we understand knowledge. Kant said that humans don't know things as they are, but only as they appear to us, filtered through the structures of our mind. Schopenhauer embraced that idea and expanded it in his main work, The World as Will and Representation. For him, the world we know is a mental representation. Everything we perceive, time, space, cause and effect, isn't something that exists out there, but tools our mind uses to organize experience. So, the reality we experience is a mental construction. We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. But Schopenhauer goes beyond Kant. He says that behind all this representation, there's a deeper force driving everything, the will. This will is irrational, blind, and never-ending, and it's the true essence of everything that exists. We only perceive its effects, its expressions. But we never get to touch the raw truth, the thing behind the curtain. What does this mean in practice? It means that everything you think is real, the chair you're sitting on, the music you're listening to, the person you love, is just a representation, not the true essence. You never access the being of things, only how they appear to you. And for Schopenhauer, this isn't just a limitation, it's a tragedy. Because we live inside an illusion we can't escape. And at the same time, we're driven by a force we'll never fully understand, the will. So, our knowledge of the world is always half true, half illusion. Wisdom, then, is in recognizing this and living humbly within the limits of reason. Now Nietzsche takes that idea and blows it up from the inside. Nietzsche doesn't want to comfort us with the idea of some hidden world behind appearances. He wants to question the very idea of truth. In one of his most famous lines, he writes, "There are no facts, only interpretations." What does that mean? For Nietzsche, there is no objective reality that we all see in the same way. What we call a fact is already an interpretation, a viewpoint, a choice, a perspective. We don't just observe the world, we shape it through the eyes we choose to see it with. This is Nietzsche's perspectivism, the idea that all perception, all knowledge, all values depend on the point of view of the observer. There is no neutral, absolute, or privileged perspective. All truth is, deep down, a will to truth, a human creation born from desires, emotions, and vital forces. But that doesn't mean anything goes or that everything is meaningless. Nietzsche isn't promoting chaos or lazy skepticism. He's proposing something deeper, that our truths always serve some kind of will, for power, for safety, for meaning. So when we say, "this is true," what we're really saying is, this is how I choose to interpret the world, based on my position, my desire, my strength. And for Nietzsche, that's actually empowering, because if the world is made of perspectives, we can create new ones. We're not trapped in one fixed way of seeing things. We can reinvent our values, our beliefs, our ways of seeing. We can make room for the multiple, the diverse, the contradictory. That's why Nietzsche doesn't want to discover the truth. He wants to create worlds. He sees the philosopher not as someone who reveals, but as someone who invents meaning. And here lies the essential difference between the two. Schopenhauer sees the world as an illusion we need to understand, and maybe overcome. Nietzsche sees the world as an interpretive construction, and says that if everything is interpretation, we should become the artists of existence. Schopenhauer tries to uncover the essence behind appearances. Nietzsche argues there is no essence, only forces interpreting the world in different ways. And us, we live as if the world is some fixed, unchanging truth. But this lesson invites us to take a second look. What you call reality might be just one version among many. Maybe the way you see yourself, others, life, and suffering isn't the only way. Maybe there are other ways of seeing. Maybe the world changes when you change how you look at it. Nietzsche doesn't want you to discover some ultimate truth. He wants you to discover your power to interpret, and with that power, recreate the world in your highest image. Because in the end, the world is the mirror of your gaze. Why bother with philosophy? Why dive into abstract ideas, question accepted truths, or explore the meaning, or the lack of it, in life? For Arthur Schopenhauer, the answer is simple and deeply human. We turn to philosophy because we suffer. In his view, philosophy is born from the pain of awareness. Animals live, want things, fight, and die without ever knowing it. But humans know. We're aware of our own mortality. We feel the emptiness of unfulfilled desires. We face a world that gives us no clear answers. And that's where philosophy comes in, as a way to make sense of our pain, or at least to make it bearable. Schopenhauer writes, with the sharp clarity of someone who's been through the dark. In the world as will and representation, he says life is driven by a blind, endless force, a will, and suffering is the unavoidable side effect of wanting anything. Life is a cycle of craving and frustration, and instead of freeing us, human reason just makes it worse by making us aware of it all. In this world, philosophy isn't some luxury or mental hobby. It's a survival tool. It's not there to entertain or build perfect utopias. It exists to help us understand ourselves, to give a name to suffering, and maybe, just maybe, to offer some kind of comfort, even if it's a tragic one. Schopenhauer saw philosophy like medicine for the soul, not a cure, but a kind of relief. It teaches us to want less, to value beauty and art, to build compassion as a moral foundation, and in the end, to accept life with clear-eyed resignation. So, to philosophize is to stand before the abyss and stay standing. Then comes Nietzsche. And with him, the abyss isn't something to endure. It becomes an invitation to create. For Friedrich Nietzsche, philosophy isn't about comfort. It's about transformation. It's not about accepting life as it is, but about pushing past what holds us back, challenging what we've been told, and inventing new values that affirm life with more strength, more freedom, more truth. Nietzsche doesn't want a philosophy that explains suffering. He wants one that makes us worthy of it. In books like The Gay Science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and The Genealogy of Morals, he lays out a new way of thinking, one that doesn't chase eternal truths, but intense affirmations of life. He says, the true philosopher is an artist of ideas. In other words, the philosopher doesn't discover truth. He creates a vision. He doesn't repeat what came before. He redefines it. He doesn't comfort. He wakes you up. Nietzsche believes traditional philosophy, especially Western metaphysics, starting with Plato, betrayed life. By putting a true world above the one we live in, by raising reason above the body, by praising being over change, philosophy became a denial of real, lived existence. That's why he writes, with the true world, we've also abolished the apparent one. Nietzsche wants a philosophy that doesn't run from time, pain, the body, or chaos. He wants a philosophy that dances with life, even when life feels wild, painful, or uncertain. While Schopenhauer sees the philosopher as someone who observes and understands, Nietzsche sees the philosopher as someone who fights and creates. Where one seeks peace by denying the will, the other sees the will as the highest form of freedom. It's a difference in how each views life. Schopenhauer believes philosophy's greatness lies in helping us endure life. Nietzsche believes its greatness lies in teaching us to love life in all its rawness. And yet, for all their differences, there's one deep connection between them. Both take life seriously. Both write with the blood of real experience. Both know that philosophy isn't some cold theory. It's a way of being in the world. So, what about you? What do you want from philosophy? A comfort for your pain? A way to explain your suffering? Or a challenge to become more than you are right now? Maybe the answer isn't just one or the other. Maybe philosophy is both, understanding and creation. Maybe it begins with pain, like Schopenhauer says, but needs Nietzsche's courage to not get stuck there. Philosophy is an act of courage. It's sitting down with the questions we'd rather avoid. It's looking in the mirror with no filters. It's building meaning, even when you know it doesn't come pre-packaged. And above all, philosophy means choosing to live with clarity. Not the bitter kind that denies everything, but the powerful kind that sees the pain, the absurdity, and still says, I want to live, and I want to live truthfully. In the end, maybe that's what philosophy is really for. Not to give life meaning, but to remind us that it can be meaningful if we show up fully, if we're brave, if we're aware. And if you can do that, you're already a philosopher. Schopenhauer and Nietzsche walked different paths, one seeking silence, the other a scream. One denied desire, the other turned it into strength. But both stared into the same thing, the emptiness of existence. And in the end, maybe their conflict isn't about who was right or wrong, but about two kinds of courage: the courage to let go and the courage to create. Now it's up to us to choose how we respond to the same abyss they faced: stay silent or dance. Thanks so much for watching until the end. If this content made you think or touched you in some way, hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and leave a comment. I'd really love to know what you think. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. There's a lot more deep and powerful content coming soon. Stick with us. The philosophy continues.